She stumbled into town broken and completely alone. He offered her water. What she whispered back changed both lives forever. Subscribe to Wild Sky Stories' new emotional tales every day. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over the dusty road leading into Willow Creek, Arizona territory, where Elijah Monroe stood beside his water wagon outside the general store. He had been making his weekly delivery, filling the barrels that kept the small town alive through the unforgiving summer months. His weathered hands worked the pump handle rhythmically, his mind wandering to the endless list of repairs waiting for him back at the ranch. That was when he saw her. She appeared at the edge of town like a mirage, a young woman in a traveling dress that had seen far better days. The pale blue fabric was coated in dust, and she walked with the uncertain gait of someone who had been moving for too long without rest. A small valise hung from her trembling hand, and her honey-colored hair had mostly escaped its pins, falling around her shoulders in tangled waves. Elijah stopped pumping and watched her approach. She moved past the blacksmith shop, past the small church with its crooked steeple, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar buildings with something that looked like desperation mixed with fear. When she finally reached the water wagon, she stopped and stared at the wooden barrel as if it contained liquid gold. Her lips were cracked, her face was flushed from the heat, and her eyes, when she lifted them to meet his, were the color of spring sage and filled with tears she was clearly fighting to hold back. "Pardon me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Might I trouble you for some water?" Elijah did not answer with words. He simply reached for the tin cup hanging from his belt, filled it from the barrel, and held it out to her. She took it with both hands, and he noticed how badly they shook. She drank slowly, closing her eyes as if the simple act of swallowing cool water was the greatest blessing she had ever received. When she finished, she handed the cup back and reached into her valise. "I have a few coins. Please, let me pay you." "Water is free to those who need it," Elijah said, his voice low and steady. "Always has been on my land, always will be." She looked up at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. It was as if she had expected cruelty and found kindness instead, and she did not quite know how to process this unexpected gift. "Thank you," she managed. "I am sorry to appear in such a state. I have been traveling for some time." "From where?" "Everywhere," she said softly. "Nowhere that matters anymore." Elijah studied her for a long moment. She was perhaps 25 years old, with delicate features that spoke of a gentler upbringing than the harsh frontier usually produced. But there was something broken in the way she held herself, something wounded that went deeper than physical exhaustion. "You have people here in Willow Creek?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "I have no people anywhere." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Elijah knew that kind of loneliness. He had lived with it for 3 years, ever since his mother had passed and left him alone on the family ranch with nothing but cattle and memories for company. "You have somewhere to stay tonight?" Again she shook her head. Elijah looked up at the sky, then back at the woman standing before him. Every instinct he had developed over 32 years of living told him to walk away, to mind his own business, to protect himself from the complications that came with getting involved in other people's troubles. But something in those sage-green eyes stopped him. "My name is Elijah Monroe," he said. "I run a cattle ranch about 4 miles east of here. I have a spare room in my house that belonged to my mother. It is clean and safe, and you are welcome to use it until you figure out where you are heading next." She stared at him as if he had spoken a foreign language. "Why would you offer such a thing to a stranger?" "Because someone offered the same to my grandmother when she arrived in this territory 50 years ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a dream of something better," Elijah replied. "She always said kindness is a debt we pay forward, not back." The woman's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she did not fight them. They spilled down her dust-covered cheeks, leaving clean tracks in their wake. "My name is Margaret Sinclair," she said, "and I do not know how to thank you for your generosity." "You can thank me by getting in the wagon before you collapse from heat exhaustion," Elijah said, not unkindly. "We can talk more once you have rested and eaten something." Margaret climbed onto the wagon seat beside him, clutching her valise in her lap like a lifeline. As Elijah guided the horses out of town and onto the open road, she sat in silence, watching the landscape roll past with those haunted green eyes. The Monroe Ranch spread across a gentle valley nestled between two ridges of red rock. A modest wooden house sat at its center, surrounded by a well-maintained barn, a chicken coop, and a vegetable garden that was clearly tended with care. It was not grand by any measure, but there was something welcoming about it, something that spoke of roots and permanence and belonging. "It is beautiful," Margaret whispered as they approached. "It has been in my family for 3 generations," Elijah said. "My grandfather built the original cabin. My father expanded it when he married my mother. I added the front porch last spring because she always talked about wanting one where she could watch the sunset. She must have loved it here." "She did," Elijah said quietly, "more than anything." He showed Margaret to the small room at the back of the house, which still held traces of his mother's presence in the handmade quilt on the bed and the dried flowers in a vase on tea. He windowsill. Margaret stood in the doorway, her eyes moving slowly over every detail. "I will leave you to rest," Elijah said. "There is fresh water in the pitcher on the washstand, and I will have supper ready in about an hour." "Mr. Monroe," Margaret called as he turned to leave. He paused and looked back at her. "I do not know how long I can stay," she said. "I do not know where I am going or what I am supposed to do with my life. I have been running for so long that I have forgotten how to stand still." Elijah considered her words carefully before responding. "Then perhaps it is time you learned." Over the following days, Margaret began to heal in ways that surprised them both. She slept for nearly 18 hours that first night, and when she finally emerged from the small room, there was already more color in her cheeks and more steadiness in her step. She insisted on earning her keep, and Elijah found himself teaching her the rhythms of ranch life, starting with the simple tasks and gradually moving to more complex ones. She learned to gather eggs without disturbing the hens. She learned to pump water from the well and carry it without spilling. She learned to recognize the different calls of the cattle and what each one meant. And slowly, piece by piece, she began to share her story. Margaret had been raised in a wealthy family in Boston, groomed to marry well and maintain the social standing her parents valued above all else. But when she refused to accept a proposal from a man she did not love, her father had disowned her and cast her out with nothing but a small allowance that had long since run out. She had traveled west, hoping to find work as a teacher or a seamstress, but jobs were scarce and prejudice against unmarried women traveling alone was not. "I've been moving from town to town for nearly a year," she told Elijah one evening as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I have been. Turned away from boarding houses, cheated by employers, and treated as if I were something shameful simply for trying to survive on my own." "People can be cruel," Elijah acknowledged, "especially to those who do not fit into the boxes they think everyone should occupy." "How do you bear it?" Margaret asked, turning to look at him. "The loneliness of living out here by yourself?" Elijah was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "I used to think loneliness was the price I paid for independence," he said finally. "But lately I have begun to wonder if maybe I was just using independence as an excuse to avoid the risk of connection." Margaret understood exactly what he meant. She had spent so long protecting herself from further rejection that she had forgotten how to open her heart to the possibility of acceptance. As the weeks passed, something began to grow between them. It started small, in shared glances across the breakfast table and comfortable silences during in chores. It deepened in long conversations about their hopes and fears, their regrets and dreams, and it blossomed in the quiet moments when their hands would accidentally brush and neither would pull away. Elijah taught Margaret to ride, patient and encouraging as she learned to trust the gentle mare he called Starlight. He taught her to read the weather by watching the clouds and to predict rain by the way the cattle behaved. He taught her the names of every wildflower that grew on his land and the history of every landmark she could see from the ridge behind the house. And without either of them quite realizing it, he was teaching her something far more important than any practical skill. He was teaching her what home felt like. One afternoon, as they worked together in the vegetable garden, Margaret suddenly stopped weeding and sat back on her heels. "Elijah," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He looked up from the row of beans he was tending. "What is it? Remember what you said to me the day we met? When you offered me water and I looked like I might fall apart at any moment. I remember. You said kindness is a debt we pay forward, not back," Margaret continued. "And I have been trying to think of how I could ever repay what you have given me. But I realized today that I have been thinking about it all wrong." Elijah set down his trowel and gave her his full attention. "How so? You did not just give me a place to stay or food to eat or work to keep my hands busy," Margaret said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You gave me something I did not even know I had lost. You gave me permission to stop running and start belonging. You showed me that a person can be gentle and strong at the same time. You made me believe that maybe, after everything I have been through, I am still worthy of kindness." Elijah crossed the space between them and knelt beside her in the soft earth. "Margaret," he said quietly, "the truth is, you have give on me just as much. Before you came, this ranch was just a piece of land I was obligated to maintain. This house was just a building full of memories I did not know how to honor. But watching you discover joy in the small things, seeing the way you greet each morning like a gift, you have reminded me why my mother loved this place so much. You have helped me see it through new eyes." Margaret reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "What happens now?" she whispered. "That depends," Elijah said. "What do you want to happen?" Margaret looked around at the garden they had planted together, at the house that had begun to feel more like home than anywhere she had ever lived, at the mountains rising purple and majestic in the distance. Then she looked back at the man kneeling beside her, this quiet, steady man who had offered a stranger water and ended up offering her so much more. "I want to stay," she said, "not because I have nowhere else to go, but because here is nowhere else I want to be. I want to watch more sunsets from that porch with you. I want to learn the names of every constellation you can see from that ridge. I want to plant more gardens and gather more eggs and ride Starlight across the valley until I know every inch of this land by heart." She paused, gathering her courage for what came next. "And I want to do all of those things with you," she continued. "Not as a guest or a charity case or someone who is just passing through. I want to do them as a partner, as someone who belongs here, as someone who has finally found what she was searching for all along." Elijah lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I have loved you since the moment you asked me for water and looked at me like you expected me to refuse," he admitted. "I have loved watching you grow stronger every day. I have loved the way you sing when you think no one is listening and the way you talk to the chickens like they understand every word. I have loved having someone to share meals with and someone to say goodnight to and someone to worry about when the weather turns bad." He reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her cheek. "Stay," he said. "Not just tonight, not just this season, but forever. Let me court you properly, the way you deserve. Let me show you that the kindness I offered that first day was not just a debt being paid forward, but the beginning of something I want to build with you. Let me spend the rest of my life teaching you home, Margaret's tears finally spilled over, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of a heart finally finding its resting place. Yes, she whispered, to all of it. Yes. The following spring they were married in the small church with the crooked steeple. The whole town turned out, including the general store owner who had witnessed their first meeting and had been rooting for them ever since. Margaret wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric. Elijah had ordered special from the city, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers picked from the ridge behind their home. As they stood before the preacher and exchanged their vows, Margaret thought about how strange and wonderful life could be. A year ago, she had been a woman with no people, no place, no hope. She had walked into Willow Creek expecting nothing and had found everything. And it had all started with a simple cup of water, offered by a man who understood that sometimes the greatest gifts are the ones that cost us nothing but mean everything. After the ceremony, they drove the wagon back to the ranch together, just as they had that first day. But this time, Margaret did not clutch her valise in her lap like a lifeline. This time, she leaned against her husband's shoulder and watched the landscape roll past with eyes full of peace instead of fear. "Are you happy?" Elijah asked as they turned onto the familiar road that led to their valley. Margaret smiled and slipped her hand into his. "I am home," she said, "and that is so much more than happy." Elijah squeezed her hand, understanding exactly what she meant, because home, they had both learned, was not just a place or a building or even a piece of land passed down through generations. Home was finding someone who saw you at your lowest and offered you water anyway. Home was having the courage to stop running and start rooting. Home was loving someone enough to teach them what belonging felt like and trusting them enough to learn the same lesson in return. And as the Monroe Ranch came into view, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, both Elijah and Margaret knew that they had found something rare and precious. They had found a love built not on grand gestures or passionate declarations, but on quiet kindness, patient teaching, and the simple truth that sometimes the greatest adventures are not about going somewhere new, but about finally arriving somewhere that matters. They had found home together.